Okay, so this is the first video in this series, and I said I'd talk about the power and peripherals. So other bits, not the central processor unit, not the graphics card, not the mother's board, but things that plug into one or more of those. So the power first. The power, well, you need power to drive the computer. I would say that you should err on the side of caution. They're not actually that expensive these days. I would say personally minimum of 850 watts. I think I bought a thousand. I think they go up to 1,100. They're quite big power units now. So you want to buy a decent power unit. Um, they are rated kind of bronze, silver, gold in terms of their kind of how economical they are and how green they are. So depends what you can afford. You can get some quite cheap power units. I would say steer clear of the really cheap ones because the power unit is one of the things you might end up troubleshooting if the computer won't start, and you want to be able to be clear that you've got enough power and you've got enough connections. The other thing I would say on the power unit is you really need to consider, well, you don't need to consider, you need to buy a modular power unit, and that's a power unit with different connections, with different cables that can be plugged and unplugged into the power unit, depending what sorts of things you put in your computer. So it definitely needs to have multiple connections for the new graphics card. So that's usually either a 6 or an 8 pin graphics card connections, multiple connections in case you want to put in multiple graphics cards later on, depending how ambitious you feel. It needs to have the latest connections, it needs to have the right connections if you're upgrading your motherboard for your motherboard. The more recent modular power units have the larger 24 pin connector and the 4, 6 or 8 pin connectors for the additional motherboard power. It needs to have enough modular connectors to be able to connect to your hard disks and or your DVD. And those are the main things that you'll be connecting into the power unit. Some of them come with fan connectors. I personally think it's a bit complicated. I prefer the fans to be separate. So in my opinion, I'd steer clear of power units that have inbuilt hybrid fan connectors and attempts to control the fans on your case as well. So decent size power, decent size, decent numbers of different connectors and modular, so you don't have to use all the cables, and that will save you space in your case. So the case is the second thing. It's the obviously the shell of your computer. If you're just swapping out a new component, then you'll obviously use the existing shell, and you need to be aware what's in that. So what sort of USB connectors have you got? What sort of have you got any sort of SD card or other connectors on the case? I would say you get a decent sized case if you're buying a new one. They're not that expensive. You need to have, I think you should buy a case that has modular connections for things like where your hard disk goes, spaces for SSDs. So a lot of cases will have separate um, brackets for solid state drives, which for me are probably now the way to go. They will have different USB. Either USB 3 is pretty much the base standard now, or USB C connections on the case, and some of them will have eSAT connections for external drives. I personally have never used an eSAT connection, so it's up to you. Again, it's a personal choice, but I don't think that is, for me, a necessary connection, but you want to look at the a case that gets a good write-up for airflow. So airflow is what keeps your components in the computer cool. It's what stops it overheating. It's what will enable you to get the most speed out of the computer. So if you're buying a new case, you want to look at your USB connections. You want to look at the airflow primarily, and it needs to be as flexible and modular as it can be. And then there are other things you can get. You can get cases with glass panels in the side, and if you're getting graphics cards that've got lights and things, they're quite useful. It just means you need to be really tidy when you organize your cables and you organize the connections in the case. If you've got a glass panel at the side. And then the other peripherals will be either the hard disk. There are a number of different hard disks now, but pretty much all of them will be SATA hard disks if they connect onto a standard connection on the motherboard. The older there may be a multi-pin connector on your motherboard, but if it is, then I would say that it's time to swap out the motherboard. They are really now quite old. So the SATA connections probably are the base standard for your hard disks. Solid state drives will also have SATA connectors in some cases, and what that will need is it needs a connection from the power unit. So you need a power unit with a number of SATA connectors, and it then will need a connection on the motherboard. We're talking about the motherboard in a different video. So each hard disk will need a power connector and a data connector. In most cases, if you've got a DVD drive, that will also have an SATA connector. Again, there may be an occasional older motherboard with multi-pin connectors, but they again are few and far between. I would say go for an SATA connection, and again similarly you'll need a connection from the power and the data connection to your motherboard. You may want to put in, I personally would avoid it, a card reader built into the case. I think that getting a USB plug-in card reader is by far more straightforward. I've had a lot of problems with card readers troubleshooting where they've been connected directly to the motherboard, so I would encourage you not to install a USB or an SATA card reader into the case. And the newer modules are they're a different shape. They're like a long either an SATA, or you'll see them called NVMe PCIe storage modules. So they will go on to the motherboard itself. The newer motherboards will have an M2 slot of varying generations. Some of the you need to make sure you've got the right slot if you're going to go for an M2 storage solution. That's the fastest solution. It can be multiple times faster than the SATA hard drives. They are now getting a lot cheaper, but they are in most cases much more expensive than the SATA standard hard drives. And even in the M2 slots, you'll pay more for the PCIe, the faster type of M2 card. If you want to add an M2 card to an older motherboard, you can get an expansion card that fits into one of the slots on the board. But I think that's for another that will be for another video. So in terms of other peripherals, I think that pretty much covers the ground. So storage wise, you'll have some form of hard disk, or require some form of hard disk. You'll usually put a DVD or a Blu-ray drive of some description, and I'd encourage you to keep away from inbuilt card readers. That's your choice. You can get card readers that plug into the motherboard or the SATA slots. I think they usually are more trouble than they're worth. And the different types of hard disk, I would say, my personal view, particularly for a simulator, I would go as a minimum for a solid state drive. There are no moving parts. It's faster. It is more responsive, and it will mean that you'll get better graphics and you'll get a smoother experience on your flight simulator, and also the computer will start faster. They're a bit more expensive, but in my opinion, if you're upgrading, you should invest in an SSD drive as a minimum, and if you can afford it, you should stretch for an M2 drive, because they are again multiple times faster, and they process information more quickly. I think that's about it on the core. So we've covered the power, we've covered the case, and we've covered peripherals. There'll be other peripherals you can put in. You can get various PCI cards to add USB, extra USB, or extra USB 3 or USB-C slots, but again, that will be for another video. This has just covered the core peripherals, and I hope that was useful. That's all I've got for you today, and I'll catch you next time.